Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Solanum tuberosum, the humble potato. Hundreds of thousands of people died from starvation, typhus and dysentery in Ireland between 1845 and 1849. As journalists travelled to investigate, each mile westward brought further evidence of the awful truth. The dying, the living, and the dead lay indiscriminately upon the same floor, without anything between them and the bare earth apart from a few miserable rags. The potato wasn't a native crop to Ireland. It is believed that Sir Walter Raleigh brought the first tuber to Ireland in 1570 from the New World. Farmers quickly discovered that the potato thrived in their cool, moist soil, and it required very little labour. An acre of fertilised land could yield up to 12 tonnes of potatoes, enough to feed a family of 6 for a year. Everything was used, and any surplus potatoes were fed to the chickens and the pigs. And the pig manure was then used to fertilise the land in order to grow the potatoes. Potatoes contain nutrients such as protein and carbohydrates. This was all necessary for a very healthy diet, but it lacked vitamin A and calcium. However, when the potatoes were combined with milk, they provided all the elements required for a healthy diet. Planting took place each spring, and a lazy bed planting technique was used. The entire field was divided into 4-foot sections, and every other section was divided into 2. A spade was taken and a cut made. There was then a cut either side, and the sod of earth was lifted. But it was lifted because it had still got a hinge on the one side. The one edge didn't cut, and it came up and over the top of the existing grass that was there to rot down later. The potatoes were then planted, manure was piled on top of the potatoes, and then soil from those trenches was piled on top of that. And then that meant that everything was raised about a foot above the ground, plus it had the drainage trenches, which was perfect. Most Irish peasants grew a potato known as lumpers. It was a high-yielding potato, but it was less nutritious than most potatoes. And it didn't mature until September and October. After harvesting, all the potatoes were very carefully stored in pits, and they were eaten during the long winter, spring and early summer months. This system worked extremely well, year after year, and everything was fine until the potato crop failed. In 1845, the summer weather in Ireland suddenly changed to a very wet and cool climate. The perfect conditions needed for Phytophthora infestans to infect the potato crop. What added to this horrendous situation was the lack of genetic variability in the potato crop. There was no natural defence against the pathogen in any of the plants, because basically they were all clones of one another. Within a week, Phytophthora infestans had discriminated nowhere. An entire healthy potato crop was reduced to a countryside of rotting plants. Again and again, for 5 long years, the blight destroyed the potato crop, and again and again, more and more people died. Throughout the famine, many Irish farmers continued to export grain and meat and other high-quality foods to Britain because the Irish peasantry lacked the money to purchase it. Half of the families in rural Ireland were living in single-roomed, windowless mud cabins. They didn't even have a chimney. Up to 12 people lived inside a cabin, sleeping in straw on the bare earth. 2 families often shared a cabin, using a dresser or cupboard to divide the living space. The cabin was also shared with the family's pig and chickens. And the pig, jokingly, was referred to as the gentleman who paid the rent, because once the pig was sold, the money was put towards the rent. Farms were mainly owned by absent landlords. They were only interested in their rental income. Many rarely or never visited their lands, and they often used middlemen. They rented out large tracts of land, and the middlemen then divided the land into small parcels, sometimes not much more than half an acre, and rented it out to peasants in need of land. And the peasants who worked so hard barely had enough money to cover that rent. When the peasants could no longer afford to pay their rent, the landlords still had to pay rates on the properties, dwellings. They were dreadful. So they just knocked them down, levelled them, tumbled them, and the inhabitants were then turned out to fend for themselves. Often they ended up making a scalpeen, and a scalpeen was a dwelling of sorts, which was made from the remnants of the old house that they'd been evicted from, which usually consisted of nothing more than a few stones and had a bit of a roof on the top. But sometimes it was even worse than that. The people then had to resort to what were called scalps. And scalps were holes in the ground. Ditches were often used for scalps, and all that consisted of was the hole and a roof made from wood and soil. Records estimate that about 1 million people died from starvation, an epidemic disease, and a further 2 million emigrated in little more than a decade between 1845 and 1855, reducing the population from approximately 8.5 million to 5.5 million. Even 50 years later, the population was still in decline and eventually fell to 4.5 million. It wasn't until 1964, over 100 years later, that Ireland's population returned to its pre-famine figures. Thank you very much.